I was standing in my backyard on a Saturday morning in June when I heard the voices, dozens of them, chattering and laughing like they were on some kind of nature tour. The problem was they were on my property, walking directly over the concrete spillway that controlled water flow from the reservoir above my land in Chattanooga, Tennessee. My name is Harold Anderson, and I had owned this 5-acre property for 8 years, specifically because it included a critical piece of water management infrastructure that the previous owner had maintained under a perpetual easement agreement with the Army Corps of Engineers. I'd jogged down the sloped lawn, my coffee still in hand, to find at least 30 people in matching yellow shirts with Meadowbrook HOA Community Hike printed on the back. They were taking selfies on top of my spillway sitting on the control gates, and one guy was even doing what looked like yoga poses on the concrete structure that prevented flooding in the neighborhoods below. "Hey," I shouted, waving my free hand. "This is private property." A woman with blonde hair cut in that aggressive bob style that somehow always signals trouble turned to face me. She had a clipboard, a whistle around her neck, and the kind of expression that told me this conversation was going to be painful. "Excuse me, sir, but this is the new Meadowbrook Community Trail," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The HOA board approved this route last month. It's for residents only, of course, but today is our inaugural community hike." I blinked at her, trying to process what I had just heard. "The what now?" "Lady, I don't know what you think you approved, but you're standing on a federally regulated spillway on my private property. You need to get these people out of here right now." She clutched her clipboard to her chest like it was a shield. "I'm Karen Matthews, president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. We sent notice to all property owners in the area about the trail construction. You should have received it." "I'm not part of your HOA," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I bought this land specifically because it wasn't in any HOA, and even if I had gotten your notice, which I didn't, you can't just decide to run a hiking trail over someone else's property without permission." Karen's expression hardened. "The survey maps showed this as community green space. We have every right to develop recreational amenities for our residents." I felt my jaw tighten. "Your survey maps are wrong. This is my deed, my land, and more importantly, this is a critical flood control structure. You can't have people walking on this." One of the hikers, an older man in expensive-looking hiking boots, chimed in. "Come on, buddy, don't be that guy. We're just trying to enjoy nature." "Nature? You're standing on concrete infrastructure that controls water flow for 3 downstream neighborhoods. See those gates?" I pointed to the metal mechanisms built into the spillway. "Those are operated remotely by the Corps. If they need to open them and you're standing here, you could get swept away. Not to mention, having all this weight and foot traffic on here could damage the structure." Karen rolled her eyes in a way that made me want to throw my coffee at her, though I restrained myself. "That seems a bit dramatic. It's just a concrete path. We've had engineers look at this." "What engineers?" I demanded. She huffed. "The HOA hired a consultant to plan the trail system. He assured us this route was perfectly safe and entirely within community boundaries." "Then your consultant is either incompetent or lying to you. Get off my property now." Karen straightened her spine and raised her whistle. She blew it sharply, and the group began to gather around her like she was some kind of scout leader. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an uncooperative resident trying to interfere with our community activity. Please proceed with the hike as planned. We have every legal right to be here." I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling the sheriff." "Go ahead," Karen said with a smug smile. "We have all our permits in order." I dialed and waited while the group continued their hike, trampling across the spillway and heading toward the wooded area on the eastern edge of my property. The sheriff's dispatcher told me a deputy would be out within the hour. I took photos and videos of everything: the people on the spillway, the new trail markers that had been installed along my fence line, and Karen's smug face as she led her group like she owned the place. Deputy Collins arrived 45 minutes later, pulling up my long driveway in his cruiser. He was a good guy, someone I had met a few times at community events in the area. I explained the situation while we walked down to the spillway. "So they just decided to run a trail over your land without asking?" he said, shaking his head. "That's exactly what happened. And it's not just my land, this is Corps of Engineers property. I have an easement to maintain it, but the federal government owns it." Deputy Collins took down all the information and photographed the new trail markers. "I can issue them a citation for trespassing, but the property dispute itself is civil. You will need to contact your attorney and possibly the Corps. Trust me, the Corps is my next call." After Deputy Collins left, I went inside and pulled out all my property documents. The deed was clear: I owned the 5 acres, and the spillway easement agreement with the Army Corps of Engineers was explicitly documented. The spillway had been built in 1978 as part of a larger flood control project after devastating floods hit the area in the mid-70s. The Corps maintained operational control, but the property owner, me, was responsible for keeping the area clear of obstructions and ensuring public safety by keeping people away from the structure. I found the contact number for the Nashville district of the Army Corps of Engineers and called first thing Monday morning. I was transferred 3 times before I finally reached someone in the regulatory division who seemed to understand the severity of the situation. "Let me get this straight," said the man on the phone, who introduced himself as David Thornton, a project manager. "An HOA constructed a public hiking trail over an active spillway without authorization." "That's correct. They had about 30 people walking on it Saturday morning. They have trail markers, benches, and they even poured gravel in some sections." There was a long pause. "Mr. Anderson, this is a serious federal violation. That spillway is critical infrastructure. Having unauthorized construction and public access on it is not only dangerous but illegal under several federal statutes. I need you to send me everything you have: photos, videos, property documents, and any communication from this HOA. I'll email it all to you within the hour." "Good. I'm going to dispatch an inspection team immediately. This is going to be treated as a priority incident. Do not let anyone else on that spillway. If they show up again, call local law enforcement, and then call this number." He gave me a direct line. I spent the rest of Monday compiling everything and sending it to David Thornton. By Tuesday afternoon, I got a call back. "Mr. Anderson, we've reviewed your documentation. I'm going to be at your property tomorrow morning at 8 with a full inspection team. We'll also be visiting the HOA to notify them of the violations and cease and desist orders." "That fast?" "Like I said, this is critical infrastructure. We don't mess around with this stuff. The penalties for what they've done are substantial." Wednesday morning arrived with heavy cloud cover that threatened rain. I met David Thornton and his team, 3 engineers and a legal representative from the Corps. They spent 2 hours examining the spillway, documenting every modification the HOA had made, and taking measurements. "This is worse than I thought," David said, pointing to where the HOA had drilled mounting brackets into the concrete for their trail signs. "They've compromised the structural integrity in several places. We're going to need to do repairs, and the HOA is going to pay for every penny of it." "What kind of penalties are we talking about?" I asked. The legal representative, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia Chen, pulled out a tablet. "Unlike construction on Corps property, interference with federal flood control infrastructure, creating a public safety hazard, we're looking at fines starting at $50,000 and potentially going much higher depending on the cost of repairs and remediation. There could also be criminal charges if we determine there was willful negligence or fraud involved." They claimed they had permits and that an engineer approved the route. Patricia's expression darkened. "We'll be investigating that. If someone represented themselves as having Corps approval when they didn't, that's fraud. If a licensed engineer signed off on this without proper review, they could lose their license." After the inspection team finished at my property, they headed to the Meadowbrook HOA office, which was located in a strip mall about 2 miles away. I wasn't present for that meeting, but David Thornton called me later that afternoon to fill me in. "It did not go well," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. The HOA president, Karen Matthews, insisted they had done everything legally. She produced a folder of documents that turned out to be mostly worthless. Their engineer was actually a landscape architect with no structural engineering credentials. The survey maps they used were outdated property records from before your purchase, and they never bothered to verify current ownership or check for easements. So what happens now? We issued an immediate cease and desist order. The trail is closed effective immediately. They have to remove all structures, signage, and improvements they made. They're also being fined $75,000 as an initial penalty, with additional fines possible once we calculate the full cost of repairs. And we're recommending that the local district attorney investigate for potential criminal charges related to the fraudulent permitting claims. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Thank you. I was worried I'd have to fight this for months." "Not with federal infrastructure, Mr. Anderson. We take this stuff very seriously. You did the right thing by calling us immediately." Over the next few days, the story exploded in the local community. The Meadowbrook HOA had about 200 homes in their development, and apparently they had been bragging about their new trail system for months. They had even raised HOA dues by $50 a month to pay for the trail construction and maintenance. When residents found out that not only was the trail illegal but that their dues had been wasted on a project that was now going to cost them tens of thousands more in fines and legal fees, the backlash was immediate and brutal. I started getting phone calls and emails from Meadowbrook residents who had found my contact information somehow. Most were apologetic and horrified by what the HOA board had done. A few were angry at me for ruining their trail, which gave me a pretty good sense of who the reasonable people were versus the entitled ones. One email stood out. It was from a woman named Jennifer Kowalski who lived in Meadowbrook and was apparently on some kind of community oversight committee. Mr. Anderson, I want to apologize on behalf of the sane residents of our community. Many of us had concerns about this trail project from the beginning, but Karen Matthews and her board allies pushed it through without proper transparency. We're organizing a recall vote to remove the entire board. Would you be willing to speak at our next community meeting? I think people need to hear directly from you about the seriousness of what happened. I agreed, mostly because I figured it might prevent future incidents if the community understood what had actually occurred. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening in the Meadowbrook Community Center. I arrived to find the place packed. Every seat was taken, and people were standing along the walls. The energy in the room was tense, with clear factions already forming. Karen Matthews sat at the front table with 4 other board members. All of them looking defensive and angry. Jennifer introduced me, and I walked to the front of the room. I had prepared some notes but decided to just speak from the heart. My name is Harold Anderson, and I own the property where the Meadowbrook HOA built their trail. I want to start by saying that I understand many of you are upset and disappointed about losing access to what you thought was a community amenity. I get that. But I need to explain why this situation is so serious and why I had no choice but to report it to the authorities. I pulled up photos on my laptop and projected them onto the screen behind me. This is the spillway on my property. It was built by the Army Corps of Engineers in 1978 to prevent flooding in this area. Before this structure existed, the neighborhoods below my property, including parts of Meadowbrook, flooded regularly during heavy rains. People died in those floods. Homes were destroyed. The room had gone quiet, I continued. This spillway controls the release of water from the reservoir above. The Corps can operate the gates remotely if dangerous conditions develop. When your HOA decided to build a trail over this structure, they didn't just trespass on my property, they created a serious public safety hazard. If those gates had opened while people were hiking on that trail, they could have been killed. The force of water through those spillways is powerful enough to sweep away cars. I showed more photos, zooming in on where the HOA had drilled into the concrete. They also damaged the structure itself. These drill holes compromised the integrity of the concrete. If that spillway had failed during a flood event because of this damage, it could have caused catastrophic flooding downstream. We're talking about millions of dollars in property damage and potential loss of life. A man in the front row raised his hand. Why didn't you just talk to them first? Why did you go straight to the feds? I did talk to them first, I said, making eye contact with Karen, who was staring daggers at me. I confronted the HOA president and the hikers on my property that Saturday morning. I was told they had permits and every legal right to be there. I was told their engineer had approved everything. When local law enforcement arrived, I was advised to contact the Corps because this was federal property. So I did what I was legally required to do. Another woman stood up. The board told us they had done all the research and gotten proper approvals. Are you saying they lied? I'm saying they were either grossly negligent or deliberately deceptive, I replied. They used outdated survey maps that didn't show current property ownership. They hired a landscape architect, not a structural engineer, to evaluate the route. They never contacted the Army Corps of Engineers to request permission or even to inquire about regulations. And they never contacted me, the actual property owner, to request an easement or access agreement. Jennifer Kowalski stood up. Can you tell us about the fines and legal consequences? The Corps has issued an initial fine of $75,000. That could go higher once they calculate the full cost of repairing the damage to the spillway. The Corps is also recommending criminal charges for fraud related to false claims about having permits and approvals. Additionally, I've been advised by my attorney that I have grounds for a civil lawsuit against the HOA for trespassing, property damage, and the costs I've incurred dealing with this situation. The room erupted. People were shouting questions, accusations were flying at the board members, and Jennifer had to bang a gavel to restore order. Karen Matthews stood up, her face flushed red. This is ridiculous. We were trying to do something nice for the community. We were trying to add value to people's homes and give families a place to enjoy nature. And now we're being treated like criminals because of some technicality. It's not a technicality. I shot back, my patience finally snapping. You built on federal property without authorization. You damaged critical infrastructure. You created a death trap and invited families to walk on it. This isn't about being a good neighbor or community spirit. This is about you being so arrogant that you couldn't be bothered to do basic due diligence before spending thousands of dollars of other people's money on an illegal project. The room fell silent again. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no words came out. Another board member, A balding man in his 50s stood up. "I think we should all take a breath here. Mistakes were made, yes, but we can fix this. We'll pay the fines, remove the trail, and move on." "It's not that simple," said a voice from the back. A tall man in a suit made his way forward. "I'm Robert Castellano, and I'm an attorney representing about 30 families in this community. We're filing a class action lawsuit against the HOA board for mismanagement of community funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud. The dues increase you imposed to fund this trail was based on false representations. You told residents this was a legitimate permitted project. You assured them the trail would increase property values and provide lasting value. Instead, you've exposed every homeowner in this association to potential liability and financial loss." Karen's face went from red to pale. "You can't do that." "We absolutely can," Robert said calmly. "And we're also demanding an independent audit of all HOA finances for the past 3 years. Several of my clients have raised concerns about other questionable expenditures by this board." The meeting devolved into chaos after that. I slipped out while people were shouting and gesturing at each other. I had said what I needed to say, and I had no desire to watch the HOA tear itself apart, even though they absolutely deserved it. Over the next 2 weeks, things moved quickly. The Army Corps of Engineers brought in a contractor to assess and repair the spillway damage. The final bill came to $32,000, which they added to the HOA's fines. The total penalty was now $107,000, due within 90 days. The HOA's insurance company refused to cover the fines, citing a clause that excluded coverage for intentional or willfully negligent acts. That meant the cost was going to come directly out of the HOA's reserves, which, according to documents that leaked during the audit, were already dangerously low because Karen and her board had been spending money on all sorts of questionable projects. The recall vote happened 3 weeks after the community meeting. All 5 board members were removed by overwhelming margins. A new board was elected, and their first official act was to hire a law firm to explore their options for recovering funds from the former board members personally. Then the criminal investigation began. The district attorney for Hamilton County, a no-nonsense former prosecutor named Angela Briggs, announced that her office was investigating the HOA's claims about having permits and engineer approval for the trail. I was called in to give a statement to the DA's investigator, a detective named Marcus Webb who specialized in fraud cases. We met at a coffee shop near my house, and I walked him through everything that had happened. "The thing that really gets me," Marcus said, taking notes on his tablet, "is that they kept doubling down. Even after you told them it was your property, even after the Corps showed up, they kept insisting they had done everything right." "Karen Matthews is not someone who admits mistakes," I said. "She's one of those people who believes that confidence and authority can override reality." Marcus looked up from his tablet. "Well, reality is about to override her. We've subpoenaed all the HOA's records, and we've been interviewing board members. 2 of them have already flipped and are cooperating. They're saying Karen pushed the trail project through over their objections, that she told them the legal review was complete when it wasn't, and that she personally signed off on representations to the community that she knew were false or at least hadn't verified." "What kind of charges are we talking about?" "Fraud, likely multiple counts. Possibly reckless endangerment given the safety issues. If we can prove she knowingly made false statements to obtain community approval and funds, that's theft by deception. We're building a solid case." True to his word, 3 weeks later, Karen Matthews and 2 other board members were arrested and charged with multiple felonies. The charges included fraud, theft by deception, and reckless endangerment. The bail hearing was a circus, with Karen's attorney arguing that she was a pillar of the community who had made an honest mistake. The judge wasn't buying it. "Counselor, your client spearheaded a project that involved trespassing on federal property, damaging critical infrastructure, and creating a significant public safety hazard. She did so after being explicitly told by the property owner and law enforcement that the project was illegal. She then made false statements to her community to cover up these actions. That's not an honest mistake. That's a pattern of deliberate misconduct. Bail is set at $50,000. Meanwhile, my attorney, a sharp litigator named Thomas Brennan, had filed a civil lawsuit against the HOA for damages. We were seeking compensation for my time, legal fees, the emotional distress of having my property invaded, and the diminution of property value caused by having a federal investigation and criminal case associated with my land. "We have them dead to rights," Thomas said during one of our meetings. "The new HOA board actually wants to settle. They know if this goes to trial, you're going to win, and the judgment could be substantial. They're offering $30,000 to make it go away." "What do you think?" I asked. "I think we could get more at trial, but trials are expensive and time-consuming. $30,000 covers your legal fees and compensates you fairly for the hassle. It's not a bad offer." I agreed to the settlement. The money was nice, but honestly, the vindication mattered more. The new HOA board issued a formal apology, both privately to me and publicly to the community. They also implemented new policies requiring independent legal review and community votes for any project over $10,000. The criminal trial for Karen Matthews and her co-defendants began in late October. I was called as a witness and spent an entire day on the stand explaining what had happened. The prosecution had an overwhelming amount of evidence documents, emails, testimony from other board members, and expert witnesses from the Corps explaining the severity of the violations. Karen's defense was essentially that she had relied on bad advice from consultants and hadn't understood the legal requirements. The jury didn't buy it. After 4 days of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on most charges. Karen was convicted of multiple counts of fraud and 1 count of reckless endangerment. The other 2 defendants were convicted of lesser charges. Sentencing happened in December. Karen got 2 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 1 year. She was also ordered to pay restitution, her share being $40,000. The other defendants got probation and community service, along with their portions of the restitution. I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom. When the judge handed down Karen's sentence, I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Just a weary relief that it was finally over. After the hearing, I ran into Jennifer Kowalski in the parking lot. She had also attended the sentencing. "Thank you for doing the right thing," she said. "I know this whole thing has been a nightmare for you." "It wasn't exactly fun for your community either," I replied. "No, but we needed the wake-up call. We had gotten complacent, let the board do whatever they wanted without oversight. That's changed now. We have new bylaws, better transparency, and people are actually paying attention. That's good." "How are things going with the recovery efforts?" Jennifer sighed. "It's been rough. The fines wiped out our reserves. We had to do a special assessment. Every homeowner had to pay an extra $500 to cover the costs. A lot of people are still angry, but at least it's directed at the right people now. And the lawsuit against the former board members is moving forward. We might recover some of the money eventually. I hope you do. For what it's worth, I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to protect my property and make sure no one got hurt. I know, and most people understand that now. The ones who don't, well, they're the same ones who thought the trail was a good idea in the first place." We talked for a few more minutes before going our separate ways. I drove home as the sun was setting, the winter light turning the Tennessee hills golden and orange. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck for a moment, looking down at the spillway in the distance. The Corps had done excellent work repairing it. You couldn't even tell where the damage had been. The trail markers were gone, the gravel had been removed, and the area looked exactly as it had before Karen Matthews decided to play land developer with other people's property. I got out of the truck and walked down to the spillway, something I hadn't done much since the whole ordeal began. The concrete was cool under my feet, and I could hear the steady flow of water through the control gates. This structure had stood here for almost 50 years, quietly doing its job, preventing floods, protecting homes and lives. That was the thing that Karen and her board had never understood. This wasn't about being difficult or antisocial. It wasn't about refusing to share or be a good neighbor. It was about respecting the purpose and importance of critical infrastructure. It was about understanding that some things are more important than hiking trails and community amenities. I thought about all the families living in the neighborhoods below my property, people who had no idea how close they had come to disaster. If that spillway had failed, if those gates had opened while people were standing on them, if the damage had weakened the structure enough to cause a breach during the next major storm, the consequences would have been catastrophic, and Karen Matthews would have blamed everyone but herself. She would have said the Corps should have had better signage, that I should have been more cooperative, that the engineer who approved the project had misled them. She would never have accepted that the fault was hers, that her arrogance and refusal to do basic due diligence had put lives at risk. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from David Thornton at the Corps. "Saw the sentencing results. Justice served. Thanks again for bringing this to our attention so quickly. You might have saved lives." I texted back a simple thanks and pocketed the phone. The sun had fully set now and the temperature was dropping. I walked back up to my house where warm light spilled from the windows and my dog was probably wondering where I had been. The next few months passed quietly. The story faded from local news, replaced by other dramas and scandals. The Meadowbrook HOA focused on rebuilding their reputation and finances. I went back to my normal life, working my remote job in software development and enjoying the peace and privacy of my 5 acres. In March, I got an unexpected visitor. A young couple in their 30s pulled up my driveway in a Subaru. I met them in the front yard, curious but cautious. "Mr. Anderson? I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said. "My name is Rachel and this is my husband Tom. We live in Meadowbrook in one of the houses on Pine Street." Pine Street was in the lowest elevation part of the neighborhood, directly in the path of where floodwaters would flow if the spillway ever failed. "We just wanted to thank you," Tom said. "We have 2 little kids and they love playing in the backyard. If that spillway had been damaged, if it had failed during a storm, our house would have been in the direct path. You probably saved our lives, and you definitely saved our home. We brought you this." He held out a gift basket filled with local products: honey, jam, coffee. I was taken aback. "That's really kind of you, but I just did what anyone would do." "No," Rachel said firmly. "You did what needed to be done, even though it made you unpopular with a lot of people in our neighborhood. Even though you got dragged through months of meetings and legal proceedings, you stood your ground because it was the right thing to do. That takes courage." We talked for a while, and I learned that Tom was an engineer himself, someone who understood exactly how serious the spillway situation had been. They invited me to dinner sometime, and I found myself accepting. It was nice to be reminded that most people are reasonable and decent when you get past the noise and drama. Spring turned to summer, and I watched the reservoir fill with seasonal rains. The spillway operated exactly as designed, controlling the water flow and preventing any flooding downstream. Every time I looked at it, I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that it was intact and functional, doing the job it was built to do. In June, almost exactly 1 year after the initial incident, I got a letter from the Army Corps of Engineers. It was a formal commendation thanking me for my vigilance in protecting critical infrastructure and exemplary cooperation with federal authorities. It wasn't something I had expected or even particularly wanted, but it felt like a fitting bookend to the whole saga. I framed it and hung it in my office, not out of pride but as a reminder that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing. A reminder that rules and regulations exist for important reasons. And a reminder that standing up to bullies and bureaucrats, even when it's exhausting and frustrating, is always worth it in the end. The last piece of the story fell into place in August when the civil lawsuit against the former board members concluded. The court ruled in favor of the HOA, finding that Karen Matthews and her allies had indeed breached their fiduciary duty and engaged in gross negligence. The defendants were ordered to pay restitution totaling $63,000, which would help replenish the HOA's depleted reserves. Karen, already serving her prison sentence, would be paying off her portion for years. I heard through the grapevine that she was still insisting she had done nothing wrong, that she was the victim of a vindictive property owner and an overzealous prosecution. Some people, I guess, never learn. As for me, life returned to normal. I continued to maintain the spillway area as required by my easement agreement. I even installed better fencing and clearer signage, not because the Corps required it, but because I wanted to make absolutely sure no one ever made the same mistake again. On clear evenings, I sometimes walked down to the spillway and sat on the grassy bank nearby, listening to the water and watching the sun set over the reservoir. It was peaceful there, a reminder of why I had bought this property in the first place. The land, the water, the sense of stewardship over something important. These things mattered to me. I thought occasionally about Karen Matthews and wondered if she had any moments of genuine reflection during her time in prison. Did she understand, even now, what she had done wrong? Did she grasp that her actions had put lives at risk, not just inconvenienced one property owner? Probably not. People like Karen rarely have those kinds of revelations. They're too invested in their own narrative, too certain of their own righteousness. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I had done what I needed to do, and the system, imperfect as it often is, had ultimately worked. The spillway was safe. The community was protected. The guilty had been held accountable. In September, the new Meadowbrook HOA president, a retired accountant named Dennis, reached out to me with an interesting proposal. The HOA wanted to create an educational program for residents about local infrastructure, flood control, and the importance of proper channels for community projects. They wanted to know if I would be willing to give a presentation. I thought about it for a few days before agreeing. Not because I wanted to rehash the drama or point fingers, but because I thought maybe some good could come from the whole mess. If people understood why these regulations existed, if they learned to appreciate the infrastructure that protected them every day, then maybe something positive could emerge from the disaster. The presentation took place on a Saturday morning in late September at the Meadowbrook Community Center. About 40 people showed up, which was more than I expected. I put together a slideshow explaining the history of flooding in the area, how the spillway system worked, and the federal regulations that governed these structures. I talked about the 1975 floods that had killed 3 people and destroyed dozens of homes in this area. I showed historical photos of the devastation, the muddy streets, the collapsed houses. Then I showed photos of how the Corps had responded, building the reservoir and spillway system that now protected everyone. This infrastructure is invisible most of the time, I said to the group. You don't think about it. You don't see it working, but it's there every single day, managing millions of gallons of water and keeping you safe. And that's why we have regulations and oversight. That's why you can't just decide to build on these structures without permission, because the consequences of failure are catastrophic. After the presentation, several people came up to talk to me. Most were appreciative and genuinely interested in learning more. A few admitted they had been among the hikers that first Saturday and apologized for not understanding the situation. One elderly man, probably in his 70s, shook my hand firmly. I remember those floods in '75. I was living in a different house back then, closer to the river. We lost everything. I never want to see that happen again. Thank you for protecting this spillway. Those words meant more to me than any commendation or legal victory. They were a reminder that this had never been about me versus the HOA, or about property rights, or even about following regulations. It was about protecting people. It was about making sure that the infrastructure built to save lives continued to do its job. As autumn progressed and the leaves changed colors across my property, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The whole ordeal had been exhausting, frustrating, and at times infuriating. It had cost me time, money, and peace of mind. But it had also reinforced some important truths. The truth that doing the right thing is often hard but always necessary. The truth that arrogance and entitlement can lead even well-meaning people into dangerous territory. The truth that institutions and regulations, frustrating as they can sometimes be, exist to protect us from our own worst impulses. And most importantly, the truth that individual actions matter. If I had backed down that first Saturday, if I had let Karen and her hikers continue using the spillway, the consequences could have been terrible. Someone could have been injured or killed. The structure could have failed. A community could have been devastated. Instead, I made a phone call. I stood my ground. I let the system work. And because of that, the spillway was safe, the community was protected, and the people responsible for the violations were held accountable. In December, just before Christmas, I received one final piece of correspondence related to the whole affair. It was a handwritten letter from Karen Matthews, postmarked from the correctional facility where she was serving her sentence. I almost didn't open it. Part of me wanted to just throw it away, to be done with her and everything she represented. But curiosity got the better of me. So I opened the envelope and unfolded the single page inside. The letter was brief. Karen wrote that she had been doing a lot of thinking during her incarceration. She said she understood now that she had made serious mistakes and that her actions had put people at risk. She apologized for trespassing on my property, for the harassment, and for refusing to listen when I tried to warn her about the dangers. She didn't make excuses or try to justify her actions. She simply acknowledged that she had been wrong and expressed hope that I could someday forgive her. I read the letter twice, trying to gauge its sincerity. Was this genuine remorse, or just the kind of thing someone writes when they're trying to look good for a parole board? I honestly couldn't tell, and I decided it didn't really matter. I put the letter in a drawer and went about my evening. I didn't write back. Forgiveness, if it came at all, would have to happen on its own terms and in its own time. For now, I was content to move forward, to let the past stay where it belonged. Christmas came and went. The new year arrived with cold temperatures and occasional snow. My little piece of Tennessee was peaceful and quiet, exactly as I liked it. The spillway continued its silent work, managing water flow and protecting the communities below. Life, as it always does, went on. The story of the HOA hiking trail became local legend, the kind of tale people told at parties or used as a cautionary example of what not to do. For most people, it faded into memory, just another crazy thing that happened once upon a time. But for me, it remained vivid and immediate, a reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. Every time I looked at the spillway, every time I walked my property line, I remembered. And I was grateful that I had made the choices I did, even though they hadn't been easy. As winter turned towards spring again, I found myself thinking about the future. The property would need continued maintenance. The easement agreement with the Corps would require ongoing cooperation and vigilance. And there would always be the potential for new conflicts, new Karens with new terrible ideas. But I was ready for whatever came next. I had learned that I was stronger than I thought, more resilient than I had known. I had learned that institutions and laws, for all their flaws, could still serve justice. And I had learned that communities, even when divided, could ultimately come together and do the right thing. The spillway stood as it had for nearly 5 decades. Concrete and steel doing the unglamorous but essential work of preventing disaster. And I stood beside it, an accidental guardian of critical infrastructure, a reluctant hero in a drama I never asked to be part of, but that was okay. Sometimes life puts you in positions you never expected. Sometimes you have to fight battles you never wanted. And sometimes, if you're lucky and stubborn and principled enough, you win those battles and make the world just a little bit safer for everyone. The sun set over my property, painting the reservoir in shades of gold and crimson. Water flowed steadily through the spillway, controlled and measured, exactly as designed. Below, in the neighborhoods of Meadowbrook and beyond, families went about their lives, safe and dry, protected by infrastructure they would never see, and a conflict they would gradually forget. And that, I thought, was exactly how it should be. The best victories are the ones that prevent disasters rather than respond to them. The best heroes are the ones who do their job quietly, without fanfare, simply because it needs to be done. I wasn't a hero, not really. I was just a guy who owned some property and made a phone call when something went wrong. But in that moment, on that Saturday morning, when I confronted Karen and her hikers, I had stood at a crossroads. One path led to compliance and acceptance, to letting things slide for the sake of being agreeable. The other path led to conflict and difficulty, to standing firm on principle even when it made me unpopular. I had chosen the harder path, and I had never regretted it. Not when Karen was yelling at me, not during the endless meetings and legal proceedings, not even now, looking back on a year of stress and conflict, because ultimately, this wasn't about me or Karen or the HOA. It was about the spillway, and the water, and the families living below. It was about understanding that some things are more important than convenience or community amenities or getting along. Some things are worth fighting for. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to back down when you know you're right. The stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, and I turned back toward my house. There was dinner to make, work to do, life to live. The spillway would still be there tomorrow, doing its job, protecting people who would never know how close they came to disaster. And I would be there too, watching over it, making sure that no one ever again made the mistake of treating critical infrastructure like a playground. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important work, and in the end, that was all that mattered.